Thank you. Well, good morning, con todas, todos, todes. It has been a pleasure to spend these days at the University of Utah interacting with your students and faculty members, sharing ideas and attesting the great work that you all do here, so thank you. I want to thank especially Dr. Susie Porter and the Center for Latin American Studies for extending me this invitation to share my research with you today. And thank you also to my colleagues, Dr. Alejandro Quinn and Dr. Talia Dajes, who kindly invited me to visit their classes. Dr. Dajes' research work is without a doubt embedded in mine as an inspiration and source of knowledge. And finally, I would like to thank Meredith Medina and Monica Snyder for arranging the details for my visit today. So the title of my talk, as you can see there, is the potentialities of the travesti as an in-between. In this talk, I approach the travesti, a deviant figure present in Latin American culture since before the colonizers arrived in the region. The travesti was condemned and punished, taken by the colonizers as a sign of weakness, cowardice, and betrayal. Moreover, in this talk, I use the Spanish word travesti and not what could be its English translation, crossdresser, for example, because the meaning in English does not express or contain the realities of the Latin American experience, which is a post-colonial, ethnicized, and racialized one. Thus, the word travesti in Spanish allows me to consider that as Peruvian researcher, artist, and philosopher Giuseppe Campuzano states, and I quote, "The travesti is a subjectivity that adopts theaters from the opposite sex. Although this is a legitimate purpose, it turns out to be a composite of male and female theaters, which, while common to everybody at different levels, the travesti makes more explicit at the same time that they unveil the inadequacy of the existing gender norms, the exclusionary male and female," end of quote. More important, along with Campuzano, I consider that the travesti implies, and I quote, second quote there, implies a full range of possibilities between the extremes of the masculine and the feminine, end of quote. And it is not the quest or the production for another identity for the non-existing list, but it is especially for the Latin American context, and I quote, a transformative post-identity that moves away from the clean, racial, and racist distinctions and towards ethnic overlappings, end of quote. To work with the figure of the travesti is also my way of contributing to the decolonial exercise already started by diasporic scholars such as Arnaldo Cruz Malavé and Lawrence Lafontaine Stokes, among others, whose work translates queer theory into the Latin American and Caribbean experiences through their queer critique of color. Moreover, working with the travesti is my way of resisting what Maria Lugones considers a new means of colonization through sexuality, or to put it in Norma Mogrovejo's words, I am not thinking in a queer way within a Latin American context, since that is a way of neutralizing problems of class, sex, gender, or race that are typical of the region. This talk will focus on the study of the travesti to propose this figure as a vessel of theaters that can be translated into a language that has the potentiality of resisting and questioning hegemonic discourses. The term travesti, as Loana Berkins, one of the most well-known Argentinian travesti leaders, explained, and I quote, has been and is still used as a synonym of thief, HIV positive, outrageous, infected, marginal, end of quote. Nonetheless, just as with the term queer, the term travesti has been twisted by travestis in order to give new meanings to the term and connect it with the struggle, resistance, dignity, and happiness. I say this with caution, recognizing that the experience of each travesti is unique and that there is no true travesti. With these ideas in mind, I consider that a travesti is not a man dressed as a woman or a woman who looks like a man, but rather a being who eludes any fixed notion of masculinity or femininity as presented by normativity. Because of all this, I contend that the travesti is a figure of ambiguity. This implies that travestis, by means of their travestismo, distort the notion of subjectivity and the idea of an original, as defined or contemplated by the binary masculine-feminine standard imposed by patriarchal social conventions. In turn, they signal that the very notion of an original is in fact a construction. That is, the travesti does not work as an individualized or defined subjectivity. Their existence would not be, to say with Nestor Perlonger, a conscious existence, but a traveling existence, always adrift in the multiplicity of flows, in the randomness and instantaneity of encounters. Such is the particular case of Peruvian travesti Hector Acuña, Frau Diamanda, for whom the travesti, and I quote, is a hybridized man-woman sex which offers itself as a new transhuman and monstrous possibility. End of quote, and whose work I will now review. Hector Acuña is a Peruvian performer, videographer, cultural manager, writer, and DJ. Sometime in the 90s, they created the character of Frau Diamanda and started to develop their travesti performative work. Through the artistic performances they have been staging since then, Acuña examines the violence inflicted on travestis and transgender bodies, especially during the internal armed conflict in Peru that happened between 1980 and 2000, and allows the spectator to recognize that a disarticulation of perceptions and affects was produced on these bodies to take them towards a new horizon, that of the neoliberal model. In Acuña's words, and I quote, "This feeling is perhaps due to the atmosphere of extreme violence that we, the pathologized, marginalized bodies, had to face continually, a permanent situation of every man for himself, which forced people to design their own brazen survival and self-defense strategies, typical masculine qualities, one could say. At the end of this process, we recognize ourselves as bodies in a hybrid state, for we have paid a high price for our daring, moved to be visible, and nonetheless here we stand, the vedette como soldats." End of quote. Besides addressing the extreme violence that the travesti experiences in Peru, Acuña emphasizes in this quote their experience as an in-between, and the strategies that they have to use in order to survive the violence against this same experience. I refer to the reality that Acuña does not identify themselves with one of the two normatively defined gender and sexual expressions, masculine, feminine, heterosexual, homosexual, and that they are also in between nationalities and geographies, as Acuña has been living for the past 5 years in Barcelona, Spain. With this, we could say that in the case of Acuña, the in-between has to do with what Maria Marisol, the first quote, considers their state of fluctuation, fluidity, impermanence, inconsistency, and mutability, not only regarding their genders and sexualities, but also their nationality and location. Thus, in the particular case of Acuña, being a travesti implies the production of another Hector without giving up being Hector. This means, in Acuña's words, and I quote, that Frau Diamanda requires the form other or new form of Hector to be able to claim as her own everyday spaces of interaction, end of quote. As Acuña mentions in the presentation of their book Escenas Catalanas, Errancias Antropológico-Sexuales, their experience as an in-between and travesti implies perceiving the world and the universe in a different way, but also thinking in a different way. Thus, Acuña considers that the travesti twists reality, which is related to the survival techniques and resources travestis have to develop in a world that rejects them and generates violence against them. This elaboration of survival strategies and strategies of selfhood that initiate new signs of identity, as Baba mentions in the second quote, corresponds to what Baba denominates the in-between. Moreover, these techniques imply ways of relating, of loving, but also of experiencing sexuality in many different ways as practices of what Baba calls, and I quote, collaborations and contestation of domains of difference, end of quote. In the presentation of their book, Acuña explains how Escenas Catalanas addresses the experience of a travesti in Europe through a mirada travesti migrante sudaca, racializada, or South American racialized migrant travesti gaze. They also mention that in this book, this same gaze places the travesti not as a victim, but as a vampira, as a vampire that arrives in Spain and Europe para comerse todo, or to eat up everything. With the brief and fragmented encounters that Escenas Catalanas narrates, where flirting, seduction, and other ways of expressing love and desire are happening constantly, Acuña resignifies the figure of the travesti as an in-between, in that their bodies work as what Rosy Brairotti, the third quote, defines as places of transit in between zones where all ties are suspended, oases of non-belonging, spaces of detachment, end of quote. This location of travestis as in-betweens implies their empowerment. For instance, Acuña expresses that in Escenas Catalanas, the travesti appears, and I quote, as a mestiza, racialized shaman, migrant, and infected, who increases the wild outbursts sexualizing spaces that are or not hostile towards her, end of quote. In this book, the migrant South American racialized travesti is a cazadora, a hunter, an anthropologist studying white European men, a scenario that subverts colonial and historical new world, old world positionalities. This empowerment, though, requires the development of a translation system. Thus, as Argentinian social psychologist, writer, and transgender rights activist Marlene Weyer signals, travestis have, and I quote, to develop an entire system of translation that translates this word in order to find the slightest possibility for identification, end of quote, because, as Acuña states, there is no one travesti, but rather multiple travesti identities. This exercise of translation is not alien to the concept of the in-between. When approaching this notion, Santiago Silvano explains that the translator, who is in this case the travesti, performs a balancing act when constructing a discourse, as we will see particularly in the next session of my talk with the work and life experience of Claudia Rodríguez. I should mention that Acuña does not interpret their experience within the category of queer. They prefer to call it fuck art or arte marica. For them, this art functions a kind of subversive process in which the feminine and the masculine interact. Firstly, to destabilize gender binarism, gender as a category, and then to critique Peruvian society. Acuña considers themselves a creator, by which they mean that they are not a man dressed up as a woman or a woman who looks like a man. And I quote here the first quote in green. I don't identify as a masculine body who adopts a feminine form. Rather, I have chosen to move freely between the masculine and the feminine, says the artist, defining their travestido body as a ductile matter always in movement. In this regard, Acuña adds that the process of travestismo is not in itself the quest for feminization, but a mutation that implies a lot more than what is visible or can be presumed. For Acuña, and I quote, what is at stake is the fulfillment of identity dissolution, this time incarnate intangible rebel bodies that are emptied out of their masculinity and filled up with overdone femininity, end of quote. Here, Acuña is addressing their constant crossing between genders, which results in an in-between experience that is not a producer of subjectivity defined, expressed, or experienced from the normative binary, masculine-feminine, standard. Acuña's travesti performance allows them to act constantly as other, erasing all notions of normative subjectivity as unity. As they themselves point out, and I quote, is the last quote, "There can be no better paradigm than the travesti body in permanent transformation to contest the fixity of identity, all that is taken for granted, that is almighty heteronormativity," end of quote. Moreover, for Acuña, it is from this in-between position that their work and experience as a travesti breaks with the idealization of a normative community and homogeneous collective national identity, since their position as an effeminate homosexual, maricón, indigenous, and poor is inspired by the exclusion, discrimination, and rejection they have suffered to complicate such idealization. It is interesting to observe the relationship that Acuña establishes between what they consider subaltern bodies, as would be the experience of the travesti embodied in Acuña themselves, effeminate homosexual, maricón, indigenous, poor, and the way they constantly turn around or twist the supposed essence of gender and the notion of subjectivity. Acuña believes, and I quote, that subaltern bodies begin to internalize the way they are questioned, both individually and collectively, by transforming the existential ennui into pure corrosive artifice that may offend, challenge, or sexualize the gaze of others, end of quote. The travesti, as expressed in the figure and work of Acuña as a subaltern and in-between who can offend, challenge, or sexualize the gaze of others, could point to the possibility of considering the travesti as a post-hegemonic figure who holds the potential of destabilizing and resisting hegemonic discourses, as I will explain in the following section. In his discussion of Althusser's conception of materialist thinking as a practical operation at the outside of philosophy, Alberto Moreiras addresses in The Exhaustion of Difference, the politics of Latin American cultural studies, the possibility of thinking outside of the hegemonic circle, which would be, as Moreiras calls it, a post-hegemonic thinking. Pierre Macquery, a French literary critic, also worked on the proposal of a new notion of the philosophical practice, one that would also be post-hegemonic, and I quote, it's the first one, determined as a process which is no longer that of the exposition of the subject, and of quote, that is a process without a subject. What Moreiras is addressing in his book Dialoguing with the Works of Althusser and Macquery constitutes a proposal for a new framework for collectively thinking about the articulation between politics and knowledge. This new framework, as I will now explain, can help us understand the travesti as post-hegemonic in the sense that the travesti distorts the notion of subjectivity by structuring and shaping their notion of self from references that are not hegemonically accepted or recognized. Loana Berkins expresses in Travestis, Una Identidad Política, and I quote, that it's generally considered that a body with a penis would align to a masculine subjectivity and a body with a vagina would align to a feminine subjectivity. Travestismo breaks into this binary hegemonic logic that oppresses those who resist being subsumed into the categories of man and woman in Western societies, end of quote. The figure of the travesti and the practice of travestismo, therefore, could contribute to discussions and theorizations around the production and destabilization of subjectivity, just as the notion of the post-hegemonic does. As mentioned in the previous section, and according to my understanding of travestis such as Acuña, the travesti destabilize the notion of subjectivity, the idea of an original, because, as Berkins explains, the subjectivity they and other travestis produce does not correspond to the expectations of the hegemonic and the normative regimes of genders. Acuña and others not only do not express a masculine subjectivity because of their penis, neither do they produce a female or feminine subjectivity because of their travestismo. As Josefina Fernandez explains, and I quote number 3, the travesti is a nomad subject, a subject without a passport or with many, that allows them to enter the sex-gender system, end of quote. The travesti, according to Fernandez, and I quote Fernandez again, resist the dominant representations of the self because their bodies do not comply with the norms of the modern corporeal order as they transgress the limits of normative gender, as it is the case with Acuña. Indigenous scholar Joseph Pearce, and I'm going to quote him, it's the last one, states that queerness attaches itself and transforms the normative, pointing out its instability, its transigent reshaping, end of quote. Thus, the travesti, from their indeterminacy of normative genders, points out that the entire hegemonic sex role behavior is a role, an act. With this, the travesti is able to show that what is hegemonically visible, the social, is a costume, a performance, and merely an appearance, and that it can be altered and reverted, as Esther Newton points out in Mother Camp. Gareth Williams argues that hegemony, and I'm quoting Williams here, is carried out as both a potentializing force and as an active cover-up and silencing of those heterogeneous realms that expose from within the empirical impossibility or the violence of its language, end of quote. What Williams states explains why travestis are not acceptable for hegemony. Because of their heterogeneity, they can interrupt hegemony's force as they are related to and are constitutive of it. Thus, if the travesti builds their subjectivity and their bodies using norms and symbols related to hegemonic femininity, through this same process, the travesti resignifies and destabilizes these same rules and characteristics. This potentiality of the travesti interrupting hegemony's discourses around gender is what Williams refers to as post-hegemonic, and I here quoting Williams again, is the second quote, a place within the social field in which hegemonic articulations and signifying processes no longer work, in which hegemonic discourses cease to make sense. This potentiality of the post-hegemonic in the travesti can be located in Acuña's travesti performance El Stigma y la Martyr, or The Stigma and the Martyr. This performance examines the violence and oppression inflicted on certain bodies, and more precisely subaltern bodies, during Peru's internal armed conflict, recognizing, as Vidal Ortiz and Martinez state, and I quote, that the physical and symbolic violence travestis have experienced historically is not an exception, an error of the system, but rather an aspect that constitutes and is inherent to it, end of quote. This performance was presented at the Faculty of Social Sciences of the Universidad Mayor de San Marcos during a cycle of lectures on the war between the Peruvian State and the Shining Path, and it pays tribute to the victims of hate crimes and homophobia, especially those committed during the war. El Stigma y la Martyr involves two individuals wearing long dresses, one white and the other black, with faces covered by blood-stained tulle. They carry flowers in their hands and walk together slowly as if they were heading towards an altar. The atmosphere of the performance would seem to correspond to that of a rite, specifically that of a wedding. Suddenly, both characters stop and the one dressed in black scatters the petals of the flower they were holding in their hands on the floor in the form of a cross. They spread the leftover petals over their body and that of the people around them in a gesture that can be interpreted as purposefully involving and making complicit those who passively observe the actions presented before them. Subsequently, the character in black approaches the figure dressed in white, and they dance together in what looks like a celebration of an alliance. They stop, and then the character in white is stripped naked by the one in black, and their biologically imposed masculinity is uncovered, canceling the travestismo of that character. They begin to touch themselves as their face turns pale, displaying what would seem to be fear and nervousness. Then they lie on the cross that the black character has drawn on the ground as the latter begins to spread red paint over their face, their Adam's apple, their nipples, and their genitals, precisely the areas that would physically mark the biologically imposed masculinity of the individual. The black-clad character colors these areas of the character dressed in white with a fury that only stops when it appears to be over, and then they cross themselves. As I mentioned earlier, this travesti performance is intended to denounce the violence inflicted by the law against travestis and transgender bodies under the gaze of society. The law here is represented through the ambience of a wedding rite, which includes legality as granted by power and the law, but also by religion, as evidenced by the act of crossing themselves by the character in black and the similarity of the figure of the character in white with a crucified Christ. The gaze of society is represented by the people who are observing the actions that are being performed, who are indifferent to the violence and have become complicit in their passivity as it unfolds. While crossing oneself signals the end of any ceremony in Catholic rites, this is not the end of the performance. After the character in black has crossed themselves and the character in white has been crucified, the latter gets up and begins to hand out leaflets with a list of names alluding to the many others like them who were murdered or tortured because of their dissident sexuality and gender, for transgressing the hegemonic mandates on gender and the concomitant roles, represented by the red-painted Adam's apple, nipples, and genitalia. Before handing out the leaflets to the attendees, however, the character dressed in white rubs them against those areas of his body covered in the red paint, which resembles blood and is still fresh, so that when the leaflets reach the people, they are stained with blood. For Diana Taylor, in her work on performance in Latin America, performance is an expression whose function is not to inform or describe, but to do. Performance has to do more with a process than a product and refer originally to a process through which something is made to happen. Performance functions then as a practice, an episteme, a form of communication, an achievement, a way of intervening in the world. Carrying out this performance from a travesti position implies an affirmation by Acuña of their position as an in-between, an affirmation of the transgression of hegemonic gender definition and the roles allocated to these genders. As a performance that is staged from a travesti position, from a position in between, from a position of fluctuation, fluidity, impermanence, inconsistency, and mutability, as Marisol quote referred to, that initiates new signs of identity in Baba's terms, Acuña's travesti performance mixes up, confuses, alters, and disturbs gender, sexualities, and identities, and the characters it represents, as well as their actions. These are the reasons why the bodies represented in this performance were subjected to violent acts during the internal armed conflict in Peru. Additionally, the travesti element of this performance gives a special character to it because as it is done from a travesti in-betweenness, it disfigures the notion of subjectivity and opens itself up to the multiple, to whatever does not contain an individual of a concrete and fixed gender within it, making the performative act more far-reaching and thus representing not simply a single victim of violence, but many. As Ben Cifuentes Jauregui suggests in his research on travestismo and masculinity in Latin America, I quote here, travestism functions as a discursive enterprise that transforms everything it touches, end of quote. It is in this transformation of everything that the travesti touches that I see, in the case of Acuña, is post-hegemonic potential. If we examine the different historical and literary texts that have been written about the internal armed conflict in Peru, it is notorious that the violence suffered by the LGBT population during that conflict has hardly been denounced. The Lima homosexual movement has identified 10 cases of hate crimes and 500 people affected during that conflict, for which both subversive groups and military forces are responsible. However, these crimes have not been represented or written about as extensively as other violent acts. On August 11, 1984, in Huanta, Ayacucho, a group of sailors kidnapped a young homosexual travesti. This young man was disappeared along with 56 other people. Another example of this violence is the murder of a homosexual by the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement, whose corpse was found with a sign that read, "That's how the faggots die." Likewise, the capture and murder of 8 homosexuals and travestis by the members of this same subversive group on May 31, 1989 in the city of Tarapoto, San Martin, is another example of what the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement called social cleansing actions, or crusades against vice. On August 6, 1986, in Aucayacu, Shining Path began another social cleansing action in which 10 people were captured and executed, including homosexual and women engaged in prostitution. Also, on September 12, 1988, in La Hollada, Pucallpa, Shining Path executed 8 people who were considered cabros, homosexuals, prostis, sex workers, and fumones, drug users, but this same armed group. Within the LGBT population, the social cleansing actions of the Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement were especially aimed for moral reasons at homosexuals, travestis, and transgender people. As pointed out in the Lima Homosexual Movement Annual Report, for these subversive groups, homosexual, travestis, and transgender people, in addition to posing a danger triggered by prejudices and the stigma associated with these transgressive genders and sexualities, were the very renewal of the authoritarian order based on a model of exacerbated masculinity that was practiced and reproduced within these subversive groups. Thus, these hate crimes were aimed at restoring the hegemonic normality broken by the existence of these sex dissidents, since they represented a rejection of both sexual and gender identities as defined and imposed by hegemonic norms, the very same norms that these subversive groups interestingly reproduce while calling themselves revolutionary. Moreover, these acts of violence against sexual and gender dissidents were contemplated with indifference by the civilian population, which often approved such acts as they were regarded as acts of moral prophylaxis. As I mentioned before, in the construction of the official narratives of the Peruvian internal armed conflict, these crimes have not been properly addressed or represented. While 4 landmark cases were included in the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, setting aside cases of torture, cruel treatment, and forced displacement against LGBT members of the population, its main objective was not to investigate and document these crimes in a particular and systematic way, since the subject was addressed in only 2 pages of a 12-volume report, 2 pages. It is evident then that there has been some marginalization in the way memories of the internal armed conflict and the victimization of LGBT people have been constructed. Some representations, therefore, have displaced others in the attempt to gain visibility and constitute themselves as hegemonic. Hence, the importance of Hector Acuña's Travesti performance, El Stigma y la Martyr, as an act of commemoration and denunciation that implies a renewal and negotiation of the acts themselves, the practice, and the accounts about the events, the hegemonic narrative of the internal armed conflict. This is carried out from the position of a figure, the travesti, who transgresses genders and their roles as hegemonically stipulated. Acuña's Travestis performance thus commemorates and denounces the violence inflicted on homosexuals, travestis, and transsexuals during the internal armed conflict from their own position of dissent and simultaneously recognizes and affirms their sexual and gender dissent, resisting the way the hegemonic discourses articulates them. I point this out because the few pages devoted to the denunciation of these hates of crimes in official narratives included the names of those affected as understood from the perspective of hegemonic legality. For example, with regards to travesti and transgender people documented in the pages of the TRC report, it is notable that their names were printed according to their identity documents. Recognition then avoids remembering these people with their chosen names, their travesti and transgender names. Acuña's performance, by affirming the memory of travesti and transgender people from the in-between position of the travesti, recognizes their dissent existence. It affirms the transgression of hegemonic sexual and gender others that these travesti and transgender people perform. If, according to Mauricio Albazarrín and Juan Carlos Rincón, violence against travesti and transgender people during a period of armed conflict or dictatorship, and I quote, is a performative act that seeks to recast a social, moral, and political order, and of quote, I consider that Acuña's travesti performance resists and responds to such recasting, further affirming the existence of a different order. Let us now consider my proposal to recognize the travesti as a post-hegemonic figure. If we recall that, according to Williams, post-hegemony would point out, and I quote, a place within the social field in which hegemonic articulations and signifying processes no longer work, in which hegemonic discourses cease to make sense, and of quote, Acuña's travesti performance functions as this place described by Williams with regard to hegemony. Acuña's practice of denunciation and memory construction regarding hate crimes against homosexual, travesti, and transgender people rescues the part of armed conflicts history that has been suppressed by the official hegemonic narrative, since this later narrative consists of an official heterosexual memory in which the experience of subjects who practice dissident gender and sexuality, those outside of hegemony, is discarded. All this is staged through a figure which is also rejected by hegemony, the travesti, achieving with this performance an alternative history of the internal armed conflict, one that includes sexual dissent, that, to signal Williams' words, and I quote, haunts the inherent incompletion of hegemony's social articulations, end of quote. Acuña's travesti performance functions as the maker of another narrative that resists and destabilizes the one presented by hegemony, a narrative constructed as a result of and from within the fissure in narrative itself. In the next session, I will push the boundaries of the travesti to propose a narrative that puts into action theaters of this figure, especially their in-between positioning and their non-affirmation of subjectivity. This narrative is thought of as post-hegemonic in that, in Williams' words, it opens up a reflection to an outside that is capable of signaling the possibility of an entirely different telos from within to think. The potentiality of this narrative could be easier to understand by looking at the experience of Chilean Claudia Rodríguez. Claudia is a trans writer, activist, performer, and founder of the Travesti Activist Theater Company or Compañía Teatral de Activistas Travestis. Unlike Acuña, Rodríguez experiences herself as female and often identifies herself as a travesti, sidosa y resentida or resentful post-travesti. Nonetheless, Rodríguez states that in her case, to be a travesti is not necessarily to want to be a woman. In 2013, she published her book, Cuerpos para odiar, Sobre nuestras muertes, las travestis, no sabemos, escribir, a text that Rodríguez describes as a reflection based on hate crimes against homosexual, travestis, and transgender people. In its form, Cuerpos para odiar is a hybrid text composed of different literary genres. It includes stories, poems, chronicles, but also photographic images and drawings, as well as different fonts, colors, and sizes of letters to address the violence experienced by homosexual, travestis, and transgender people in Chile. Additionally, this text was brought to the stage in 2015, and it included activism, poetry, performance, and theater. For Rodríguez, writing Cuerpos para odiar was especially important and necessary because it implied making the existence and experience of travestis visible through writing. To put it in the terms of Matthew Edwards, this book brings to the fore marginal subjects that have historically been outside the law and outside of textuality. Edwards explains in the context of Argentina that queer lives are, and I quote, the quote is not there, sorry, that queer lives are unknown, which is to be misunderstood and documented, waiting in the wings to be included in a textual reality that is favored for its tangible, concrete, and solid nature, end of quote. Edwards and Rodríguez comments coincide with Marcha Ochoa's assertion that there is a dearth of written and archival forms of cultural production by transgender individuals themselves. Thus, and I quote Rodríguez here, which is the first quote, "We are the ones, the travestis, who should write about us," end of quote, as part of a claim to a different existence. Nelly Richard, in the context of the Chilean military dictatorship, alludes to this claim when she argues that practices outside the social contract, such as travestismo, emerge from the multiplicity of the social to claim their right to difference and position it against the repressive uniformity from which the standard identities arise. This claim to the right to difference in Cuerpos para odiar is also carried out from the editorial margins, since the book was self-managed by Rodríguez herself. In Rodriguez's words, and I quote, "The book is a precarious work, self-produced, that disobeys omnipresent cultural industries. It is a work that one could dismissively call a little book, a work of failure without a publisher," end of quote. This is to say that the production of Cuerpos para odiar arises from precariousness, not only from different bodies, these other bodies which are narrated and inscribed in the text, but also from the space from which these bodies are narrated. And I say different bodies, other bodies, because these bodies live in an indeterminacy of genders, thus becoming bodies that could be vulnerable to rejection, denial, and violence. It should also be added that these bodies are poor, indigenous, and live with HIV and AIDS. Hence, as Jack Halberstam would say, and I quote, the quote is not there, in these bodies, monstrosity and humanity reside at one and the same time, to the extent that they exhibit gendered, race, and class schemes, end of quote. Because of these same characteristics, the bodies that appear in Rodriguez's text call into question who counts as human, as much as the rules that govern what should be considered human. Judith Butler argues, and I quote the first one, that the very notion of the person is called into question by the cultural emergence of those incoherent or discontinuous gendered beings who appear to be persons, but who fail to conform to the gendered norms of cultural intelligibility by which persons are defined, end of quote. The bodies that Rodriguez narrates in her text are indeed improperly or inadequately gendered and experience a double exclusion due to the race and class to which they belong. They are socially categorized as inhuman or less than human, as they are, and I quote the second one from Butler, they are marked by class subalternity and a bodily incongruity that leaves them exposed to economic precariousness and transphobic and sexist violence, end of quote. On the other hand, however, due to these same characteristics, these bodies resist a reduction to single principles. These bodies, as post-gendered bodies, come from a non-decipherable place, even beyond the human, insofar as they are figures of absolute alterity. This is why they represent a break away from the certainties of the known and the usual, insofar as they are in constant alteration. Therefore, and following Chilean feminist critic Alejandra Castillo, we could think of these same bodies as bodies that are a place of dominance but also of resistance, thus coinciding with what is noted in the previous section with respect to the post-hegemonic potential of the travesti. With this, I refer to the fact that these marginalized post-gender bodies, because of their heterogeneity, can interrupt hegemony's unitarian form. That is perhaps why Joseph Peirce considers Cuerpos para odiar, and I quote, an archive of precarity and of possibility, a homemade body of work that nonetheless reflects a collective will to survive, end of quote. Peirce does not consider Cuerpos para odiar as simply a poetry collection, but rather names it a travesti archive in which those other bodies constitute the archive. These bodies are related to and are subjected to hegemony's force as they are opposite to normal or normative bodies. Besides this, the bodies that appear in this book interrupt hegemonic articulations around gender and sexuality, as their voices or hablas, speech discourses, as the narrator and cultural critic Juan Pablo Sutherland would say, go in the opposite direction, and they are hablas without a canonical alphabet, since they are participating in a construction of their life experience outside the rules, norms, and mandates of hegemony. This habla, speech, discourse, is related to an hacer travesti en la escritura o travestir la escritura, just as other Latin American queer writers have done before, such as Perlonger, Lemebel, Puig, and Sarduy. The heterogeneous travesti experience of Rodriguez is inscribed outside of hegemony, and as a work based on that experience, Cuerpos para Odiar inscribes a memory and an other historical archive for the ignored or negated travesti. Thus, in Gareth Williams' words, and I quote, interrupting or suspending hegemony's signifying processes and its necessary destitution of heterogeneity, end of quote. As Rodriguez herself puts it, and I quote, since people think that what's different is grotesque, I have been so hated, I have reasons for writing, end of quote. Cuerpos para Odiar translates into a claim for visibility of the experiences of the most desolate and forgotten group in Chile, especially in terms of education, culture, and memory. Excluded on account of their gender and sexual diversity and descent, they seek recognition of these experiences. Focusing on the experience of the travesti, travestismo, as Sutherland suggests, disallows the regime of truth that negates the travesti in a constant aggression that expels them, insofar as it considers the travesti a non-narratable body within the normative sex order. Thus, and following Williams, Cuerpos para Odiar would function, and I quote, as a site of dislocation within the hegemonic field that keeps the supply lines of reflection open to the notion of the other. End of quote, in this case of poor, indigenous, and HIV+ homosexual travestis. As stated in Cuerpos para Odiar, and I quote, if girls like me don't exist, it's because our lives haven't been told in children's stories. Once upon a time, there was a boy who transitioned and was happy for forever after, end of quote. Rodriguez challenges traditional dogmatic writing of literature and canonical and academic education, which has been responsible for editing and erasing everything that does not fit into heterosexist, binary, patriarchal, and heteronormative regulations, as much in form as in content. Rodriguez's text becomes a place to denounce and challenge the same hegemonic educational discursive devices that maintain those bodies and practices situated on the edges of desire, sex, gender, invisible. By using a narrative of marica, sucia, perversa, callejera, or dirty, perverse, street walking fuck, and by writing using a purposefully bad Spanish, a narrative that is fragmented translates how the travesti experience reality, how the travesti writes and expresses a particularly style of being. Thus, some of the above-mentioned characteristics with regard to the bodies that are described in Rodriguez's text can be extended likewise to the narrative of the book. That is, the narrative presents a language that is different from the hegemonic language because it does not follow orthographic or grammatical rules, an in-between language that confuses the masculine and feminine genders, and a narrative voice that is constantly being interrupted by other voices and that questions the authority of the omniscient narrator at the same time that it prevents the construction of subjectivity. Cuerpos para Odiar would be proposing a particularly way of narrating, one that emerges from the post-hegemonic position, in this case, of travestis. In the first pages of the book, a photograph appears in which we see Rodriguez with other travestis. The photograph is titled Cuerpos para Odiar, and next to it, on the margins of the page, of which Rodriguez herself appears, the precarious context of the life experience of perhaps Rodriguez is mentioned, and I quote, reading the images surrounding me, hunger, cold, childhood, alcohol, drugs, men, always tied to a risk of dying, end of quote. In this way, Cuerpos para Odiar opens a space to narrate, in addition to the individual experience of perhaps Rodriguez, that of other travesti subjects. I use the term perhaps here because although the reader could assume that the content of the book is based on Claudia Rodríguez, the author's life experience, Cuerpos para Odiar constantly puts this into question. For instance, the narrative makes the reader doubt whether the Claudia that is mentioned in the following quote is in fact Rodriguez, our author, as the voices states, éramos vecinos. We were neighbors in the masculine form, while Rodriguez refers to herself throughout the book as feminine. And I quote, is the last one, intuitively, I knew you like to wear your hair light and down to your waist, and that now they call you Claudia. I remember we were neighbors when I saw you on the news. Right away, I remember the punishments I got for looking for you, for dreaming of you, end of quote. In any case, if we assume that the content of the book does include biographical information about Claudia Rodriguez, our author, this information is not the core of the narration. As the book's first pages suggest, Cuerpos para Odiar isn't addressing the experience of Rodriguez as an individual self, but on the contrary proposes that her existence as a travesti is co-created through multiple existences, such as Zulis, who was a boy just like me, La Marce, the most beautiful mom, or La Lola. These lives have taught perhaps Rodriguez how to be a travesti and survive. I'll read the first quote. I'm travesti, and at my age, she was just like me. I said, and I realized that I had always been travesti, not a coward or ugly, just travesti, just like Lola, end of quote. This resonates with Perlonger's affirmation that travesti subjects are not to be conceived of as individualized or defined subjectivities, since they are always, and I quote, adrift in the multiplicity of flows, in the randomness and instantaneity of encounters, end of quote. Cuerpos para Odiar then proposes that the construction and survival of the travesti is a co-creation that depends on the dialogue and relations it maintains with other marginalized or subaltern lives. The travesti would not be then an individual existence, but rather a subject who constructs and inscribes themselves and survives in a multiple form. Or, as Rodriguez would say, and I quote the third one, you learn to be travesti by watching other travestis, end of quote. For Pierce, these experiences of the travestis generate knowledge, but also develop a pedagogy and a solidarity. In this sense, I agree with Pierce when he states that the travesti body is affected by its reverberation with other bodies, those other bodies that must exist in order for hers to make sense to be. This relation, though, is not exclusive to travestis, as stated in the initial pages of the narrative, and I quote, travestis are just like the Mapuches in the countryside, just like women of the olden days. By talking with the older ladies, we learn to think about what the body has to do with it, about desire, which is the same as learning to see, end of quote. Susie Shock also sees the importance of the relation and solidarity between travestis and other subaltern groups. Thus, Shock expresses, and I quote the first one, we see ourselves as travestis, and that's where there's some crossover between our struggles and those of the First Nation or the Indians, end of quote. However, Rodriguez and Shock are not the only travestis that recognize this relation. Marlene Wire points out, and I quote, that subjects like travestis and First Nations communities have been and we continue to be victims, end of quote. There is a mutual understanding and sharing of experiences desde el despoder, but also a call for unity among these bodies who empathize in their subalternity and precarity. Here also we find a kind of pedagogy, in Pierre's terms, in which one can learn to be travesti and to survive in dialogue with other lives, such as those of Mapuche women out in the countryside, old and Asian women. This is complemented throughout with the images the book incorporates. Cuerpos para Odiar includes many pictures of travestis, but also of Mapuches and of other indigenous women as well. The bodies of all these lives are monstrous bodies, bodies to hate. With this, the book points out that the travesti belongs to a community de lo diferente y grotesco, the different and grotesque. Moreover, from this, Cuerpos para Odiar affirms that the writing of the book itself stems from this multiple existence of the travesti and the community of the ugly and grotesque. The narrative voice, perhaps Rodriguez, notes, and I quote, the last one, "I write because I haven't been the only one. My travesti friends and I, we have been rejected. That's why I write," end of quote. The narrative of Cuerpos para Odiar seems to be a narrative that is for, with, and because of the other, and not the self. While Cuerpos para Odiar is narrating the life experience of perhaps Rodriguez, this same narration is interrupted by other voices that bring other stories. This gesture affirms the multiplicity of the travesti, but can also be connected to what has been discussed in the previous paragraph regarding the pedagogy of the other, as these interruptions continue expressing that the travesti learns to be and to survive from and through other lives that are also considered grotesque and monstrous, and from an origin that must be erased. This can be seen in the following words uttered by an unidentified voice, and I quote, "And who are you? Have they thrown you in jail ever? To be travesti, you have to be brave. You have to show you can do it," end of quote. Or in these words, where different voices get confused. "We didn't have borders or skin or faces or surfaces up to meeting Lola. She said, 'I'm travesti,' and I'd never heard this word before, and it complemented me, and it became real because she was." Sometimes these different voices in Cuerpos para Odiar differ by the type and color of the fonts in which they are typeset. For example, on page 13, when perhaps Rodriguez approaches her own experience with the maternal figure, and I quote, is the third one, "Mother, Maere, came from the most southern place in the south. She had 3 daughters there. When my father's father died, they moved north to this ranch where they were the first inhabitants," end of quote. At the same time that she goes back to her own origins, she opens up the text, its space, to accommodate the voices of others in solidarity. In the page margins and using another color and typeface, someone says, and I quote, is the last one, "Mom, it's a horrific feeling knowing that one will disappear from a word that will continue on just as content without us," end of quote. We can tell this is a different narrative voice from that of perhaps Rodriguez by the word "mama," mom, is used, since when Rodriguez is speaking, she uses the term "maere" for mother. Rodriguez's book is performing an act of multiplicity, holding the voice of many within a space she could have withheld for herself. In this sense, Rodriguez's narrative can be understood as destroying or undoing the notion of the self, because these voices, speaking alongside her own, demonstrate that Rodriguez's story is both hers and not hers, in text as in life, as I have explained in the previous paragraphs. Besides this constant interruption by other voices and stories, a narrative that is jumping from one experience to another without settling anywhere, never staying in any of them permanently, indicates that Cuerpos para Odiar is not putting forward or affirming a clear subjectivity, neither for Rodriguez nor for the different voices and experiences that are included in the book. This lack of subjectivity and the impossibility of constructing a clear self through the book's narrative is supported by the use of an in-between language. Thus, the narrative is fluid, impermanent, and inconsistent when expressing the genders that potentially refer to Rodriguez herself. For instance, the narrative uses sentences such as, and I quote, niñas como yo, which may refer to Rodriguez, and others, such as, but more than anything, I jumble the path of words. My mom tells me I'm silly, boy, tonto. That may also apply to Rodriguez. If we suppose that Cuerpos para Odiar is narrated from the voice of a normatively defined male narrator, Rodriguez, in the book the same narrator is normatively defined as a female being, thereby disordering the hegemonic masculine-feminine mandate, as it confuses the genders. The same happens in the following passage, it's the third one, and I quote, my aunt asked my mom about the boy because she liked the cousin trouble and she knew I was loca. I woke up at the last minute, my lashes stuck together with mascara, smelling like cobbling, and at least 50 lucas in a pisco flask. How's the boy doing? She asked, like always, and my mom responded. She woke up early to go to the clinic because she felt sick, end of quote. The narrative voice of what could be Rodriguez refers to herself in an in-between way, sometimes as a normatively defined male, sometimes as a normatively defined female. This confusion of genders goes hand in hand with the voices of other subjects who try to impose a fixed gender to perhaps Rodriguez and explain to her that she is a boy and not a girl. And I quote, the last one, and I stopped feeling my body when they yell at me, you aren't a girl, you are a boy, end of quote. Or when the narrative voice informs that the mother uses masculine nouns and adjectives were referring to her, and I quote, my mother doesn't want me to keep playing. She hits me and says, I am a silly boy, tonto, end of quote. This is extended to other subjects who are included in the narrative, such as La Barbie, and I quote, with her, we were all little trainees, barbudas, and vulnerable asses, end of quote. Besides this, and as I mentioned before, the language of Cuerpos para Odiar distances itself from hegemonic discourse in its form, as it does not follow orthographic or grammatical rules. This has to do with the need to break language in order to break the old and traditional patriarchal ways of existing. The language is fluid and does not use comma or full stops to organize the discourse. It has orthographic mistakes and does not use accents where needed as part of the stylistic torsions that Rodriguez employs. And I'll read that big quote there. Tenderly kissing Chuminga is a sin. Seems like in the world of adults, everything is a sin. It is a sin to not want to play with my siblings, to go toe-to-toe with the trees, with my girlfriends, to be as funny as that girl who climbed the tallest fig tree and with a dirty face said, no come here any Yankee, as if we could go in and out of stories, put ourselves inside a TV and occupy the spaces of artists without any risk of running into some angry old person who pulls my hair or kicks me out of the movie or skins my knees as I go by the edges of the TV, or who give me an electrical shock and we die laughing because nobody can talk to us about the end of the world, end of quote. The long sentences contribute to the fluidity of the language, a language that does not pause and that also supports the confusion of genders. Thus, although the narrative voice that may pertain to Rodriguez, normatively defined as biologically male, narrates herself as a feminine being, she reverts to the masculine form when, as is the case of the previous quote, the voice expresses itself in a masculine form, ocupar el lugar de los artistas and not of actrices. With this, we see how the fluid language and the narration from an in-between position are interweaved. As the Spanish sociologist and trans activist Miquel Misé points out, and I quote, language plays a very important role in our identity because we define ourselves, think, act, and in fact exist through it, end of quote. The language of cuerpos para odiar that I have been describing, like the travesti, distances itself from and at the same time destabilizes the reality constructed by hegemonic normativity, which excludes and impedes the existence of the travesti. This is why, through the same language, the narrative reinscribes the travesti experience, which is violated by hegemonic language, as the following quote suggests. And I quote, "Faggot, they yell at me. The language became quiet and destroyed everything in its path." Another quote, "The words twisted me. They turned into pulling forces that erased me." And another quote, "The vowels had nothing compassionate to say. When the teachers taught me to combine letters, I mixed them up and interpreted them incorrectly because they didn't have anything to do with me. I was always incomplete," end of quote. These phrases go against orthographic and grammatical norms in Spanish, as they include misspellings and follow oral practice rather than written. As Nelly Richard points out, sexual otherness requires other languages that break with the transparency of expressive conventions. These other languages, in the case of the travesti, is a language of dissent that disrupts the notion of belonging to a specific gender and expresses in turn a dissent with regards to gender identity. When it becomes writing, it also mishandles the regulations of hegemonic discursivity, as it deteriorizes the power regimes of normativized and officially centered identity. Here I have explored the other language of the travesti in Cuerpos para Odiar, a language that emerges from the very same travesti experience and how it works as a site of encounter and common learning and construction. In other words, the book poses a language that is an experience of commonality, an experience in common outside of the hegemony. The language of the text, as we have seen, goes from the individual to the collective. It is written from a position that breaks away from the concept of normative subjectivity, which belongs to the field of hegemony, and opens itself instead to the experience of the multiple, away from normative homogeneity and towards radical heterogeneity. Thank you very much.
I snuck up behind you because I was trying to keep the lights on. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk, and there's so much here for us to talk about and share and continue the conversation. So we'll open it up for questions, comments, observations that anyone has. Do you want to just go ahead and call on people when they have questions?
Yeah. Anybody? A question or a comment, or maybe you have read Claudia's work, or know something about marginalized people in Peru and Chile or anywhere.
Have you met Claudia?
Not in person, but through Zoom.
Through Zoom,
Yes,
okay.
yeah. It's like really, really nice. And what is happening right now, I think that there is a shift, a necessary shift, in my opinion, in the academic world, that in the last LASA, which is one of the biggest congress that takes place here in the US regarding Latin American in general, including culture, history, etc. There was this panel where Claudia and other travestis were invited, So I think it's important that besides, like working with books and theory and criticism, to bring the direct voices and experiences of these people, So for me, it was a great surprise to see them there speaking in Spanish, in their non-canonical or correct Spanish, So, yeah. Other questions or comments? Ale?
Yeah, thank you, Erika, for a great talk. I wanted to go back to your ideas of the post-hegemonic and the post-hegemonic figure, and you mentioned several definitions, right? Several ways of approaching this concept, one of which was post-hegemony as a process without a subject, right? And so I was thinking, and I guess it's clear, it's more clear probably in the work of, or at least for me, in the work of Claudia Rodríguez, in the way you explain it. So the travesti, how you are conceptualizing this, can be described as a non-subject, basically. Is it necessary for it to be a non-subject, or could there be a non-hegemonic or a post-hegemonic conception of subjectivity?
Yeah, I think that that's what he or she or them are doing, which is destabilize the notion of subjectivity, as we create subjectivity, or the notion of the subject from an hegemonic position. And I guess because of the multiplicity of beings that are being created, co-created in their own practice or in their own performance or even in their own life. And I'm not generalizing to all travestis, no, I'm speaking about the specific work and life experience of these people, no? The way they conceive themselves, the way they do their art, and the way they live. Yes.
So it would be that way.
Sí.
Thank you.
Thank you
Gracias.
for coming.
So you talked a lot about this text, Cuerpos para odiar, and I don't know it, but I was really interested in the way that you were describing it as containing photographs and also having text in different fonts and different colors. I wonder if you could describe it a little bit more to give us a better idea. And specifically, I'm thinking about the way that you were talking about language and how the text had these kind of new non-canonical practices of writing. What did you say? Abolish without a canonical alphabet, which I thought was a really interesting concept. But thinking about how the text is structured, so I don't really know, I wonder if you could also talk about maybe a different practice or a different practice of reading as well.
Yes, exactly. That's very interesting, because besides creating this book in this way that I have been describing, it also puts the reader in the position of being out of their own, normativity or, hegemonic position, in order to be open, if you want to continue reading this product that, as I mentioned, could be described as a book of poetry, but I don't think it's just a book of poetry. It's composed of so many genres, pictures, and it's very, very difficult to follow a narrative, right? So that's also something that impacts your experience of reading, because it breaks with all your expectations as a reader, as a common reader, as a traditional reader, when you touch that book, no, and you encounter that book, no? You can get confused, you don't have any certainty, right? You don't know who is talking, and you don't know if what was said in page 3 has something to do with page 4. So in a way, it also is kind of rayuela, that you can read it in different ways, you see. So I think that it's also about the freedom, no, that gives to the reader, and of course the colors, the kind of photographs or images that it includes, that can be photographs that are very erotic, photographs that show murderer bodies, no, children, mapuches, or ladies, no. So it's also a collection, a historical archive as well, because it also deals with the dictatorship, but that was something that I didn't want to touch upon today, no? So many things, like a Pandora box, to be honest. Yes.
That was a good segue, because I was going to maybe mention the dictatorship. Sorry, maybe you didn't want to talk about it, but you mentioned Puig and Sarduy, like Argentinian literature, Cuban literature. I was curious about the history in Chile, like Diamanda and Erika, and literature about, a female body, like in that text in the dictatorship, right? And what she was doing with her her art group.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you like Cada, that art group. And because I'm not familiar with this work, and thank you, I really enjoyed the
Thank you.
presentation, and I'm not familiar with the performance either. But I'm curious because it sounds like there's a performance element and there's a literary element. And so I was curious about how you see Claudia's work in relationship with that history in Chile, I guess specifically with El Tit, and then maybe some more contemporary works. Like I know, help me out here, someone did Melchor present last year with Temporada de Huracanes, hurricane season, a text from Mexico from Fernando Melchor, and the main character in that, well, one of the main characters, La Bruja, and like violence towards transgender, like a transgender subjectivity in that book, the way that operates. So I guess I'm curious about that, like where you see her writing and her performance fitting in a larger Latin American context. And then my last thing, I'm sorry, but it's another book. I haven't read this other book either, but I've read about it and I want to get a hold of it. But there's a book from Argentina in disability studies from someone named Matias Fernandez Bursaco, I don't know if anyone's saying it's called Formas Propias. And I just read about it and I want to get a hold of it, but I'm curious because it seems like it's, I think the subtitle of that book is Diario de un Cuerpo en Guerra, like a diary of a body in war. And so you talked about like connections of this work with marginalized bodies, like the figure of the grotesque, because Matias's work really interested me, inspired me from writing from, place of experience. Because he really owns that language. He talks about like his body being in war. Anyway, that's a lot, but I'm just curious how you see her work fitting in that greater Latin American
I'm gonna
context.
try to cover everything
Sorry.
that you mentioned and say, no, thank you for your questions. So you talk about El Tit, and we're talking about Claudia, and then you mentioned this Argentinian Matias. And for sure, the three of them have in common the body, right? And I think that the three of them, thinking about Lumpérica, have been producing and writing in different contexts, historical contexts, These three different historical contexts, in my opinion, have demanded new languages, in order to address what they wanted to say in that specifically historical moment, or the historical period or experience that they were relating to. So we have El Tit, as you said, in Lumpérica, it's addressing torture, suffering, the dictatorship in general and all its miseries in Chile. And there was a need, as Richard and others have said, to create a new language in order to communicate, to transform, to touch upon pain, suffering, injustice, etc. So El Tit chose a body that was penetrated by this light, that was constantly causing pain. Then we have Claudia, which I think is writing from a different historical moment, which is the moment, in a way, where we live right now, where travesticidios, feminicidios, etc., have been more visible because of technology, because of social structures like Facebook, etc., And in this neoliberal world that we are living, I guess that there is more space because we commodify them, in so many ways to make them visible, but also to give space to somebody as Claudia to be able to be interesting for the academic world, right? And I think that although in Latin America there are more countries that have approved uniones civiles or same-sex genders, violence is worse than ever, and especially for the transgender population, it's really difficult to survive. I think it's 35 years old the expectation of life for them in Latin America. So it's a different urgency in regards to the body, what they write. It's a different, in my opinion, motivation than El Tits, no? El Tits, Lumpérica was critiquing, denouncing, representing, no? Addressing something that had already happened, no? That could happen again, and we saw in 2019 what happened in Chile. We saw some replications of the dictatorship's techniques, no? Rapes to women and violence by carabineros, etc. Claudia is writing in a different historical moment where things are continuously happening and are happening more and more and more. So it's a body that has a literary body, a performatic body that is trying to reach something different. And in the case of the Argentinian writer that you are talking about, I don't know his work, but I know in general that also people with disability are starting to write more and more, and I think it's urgent to include them and make them more visible in regards of their own disability and marginalization, no? Because as a civilization, what are we calling marginalized population, no? I mean, because of the colonial experience, we have said how race and ethnicity have been number one, but historically we have been including more population, subjects, practices, no, into this list. And my feeling is that maybe it's going to be the time to include people with disabilities, no? Which is, to be honest, an area that I don't work with or I don't have that much knowledge about. But thank you for the reference, yes. I mean, I don't know if I answered all your questions.
No, you did. That was really
I
helpful.
mean,
The
I did.
contextualizing, connecting as well, like LT in the present. Thank you. That was really helpful.
And we can talk about something that I read about the body, like with the LGBT community or with the travestis, is poverty, the body of poverty, because it's hard for them to find jobs. It's hard for them, like right now, like people are not including them on those, and everything. So I think she talks about it, you talk about it, like the body of poverty, how that is like a huge deal for them,
Yes, it's also how we talk in terms of different levels of subalternity, right? Because one thing, we know how we must include intersectional analysis in what we do, because it's not the same to be a white travesti, no, than an indigenous travesti, a poor travesti, middle class travesti. And yeah, as you mentioned, most of them have to work as prostitutes because they cannot find jobs, no? Because they don't look well for businesses. So they have to go and work in those kinds of jobs. But also thinking about the pandemic, right? In the last 2 years, I think that also the travesti and transgender populations have been impacted, and they have had to create new ways of making money, no? Because it's not only their constant vulnerability of being killed, but they are being killed systematically, no? But these kinds of symbolical assassinations that we do to them.
Water.
It's okay.
So sorry, I had to see that. Could you talk a little bit more about the way that race and ethnicity work in these performances and the writings?
The way what, excuse me?
Race and ethnicity. I was struck in particular in some of the citations from Cuerpos para Odiar, the invocation of Mapuche. I don't get the sense that the people who are that Claudia is not indigenous, I don't know, but it didn't seem like that comes up in the text. And I wonder, is the invocation of Mapuche a way of invoking vulnerable or stigmatized populations, or is there an alliance? Is there a collaboration? Is there a communication? That's one thing that occurs to me, but there might be other ways that you want to talk about race and ethnicity and how they work in those projects. And then the first one, Frau Diamanda, she's dressed in a very Orientalist outfit, right? So how do race and ethnicity work in this?
I think that's why I think that it's very clear that for me, Acuña is in the in-between, because they are always playing with their nationalities and the way they dress. And I guess it depends on the performance also that he's doing, or she's doing, or they are doing, because Acuña always jumps also on these terms. I think that in their case, race and ethnicity is more clear than with Claudia, because Acuña is indigenous and she looks indigenous, and they talk about how their experience as a travesti have been impacted by the race, right? In the case of Claudia, I don't think she looks or she is as indigenous as Acuña, and I think that she talks about Mapuches more in the sense that they are also a marginalized community and how they can extend a solidarity to each other and learn to survive. And that's a huge opening for us to think about how we think in terms of learning, survival, strategies, that opens these alliances in between different populations, I don't know if I answered.
So you don't see it as an appropriation?
From Claudia?
It actually maybe Acuña and Rodriguez. I mean, it's and I think about that appropriation, like how, so in Acuña, or the resonances of those taking on those identities or calling for a solidarity that.
I guess I don't think it's appropriation, because what they are doing is deconstruct the idea of identity, and maybe I'm wrong, I will have to think more about that. And I guess that the intention that they are having, or the reasons why they are dialoguing with these other identities, it's important in the sense that they want to deconstruct and not affirm, But I will have to think more about that. And also go back to the performance that they were doing in that picture to remember what was the heart of the performance and why they were dressed like that. It might be that because the Chinese, Japanese communities in Peru are like really big, because they were brought as slaves, and they are marginalized as well, right? So I would have to go back to that and see if that was related to that, and then that would be a completely different turn in why they were dressed like that.
Yeah, interesting.
Yes. See.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting and a lot of complex issues to talk about. So, in thinking about marginalized communities and what they either write about or perform about or ask for, there usually tends to be a focus on equality, inclusion, right? And here it doesn't seem to be there. I mean, it may be there in different quotes or different parts that you haven't included, but the focus to me seemed to be in heterogeneity, right? On the affirming the
Yes,
heterogeneous quality of that. And I was wondering if that's because maybe the discourse of or around equality has also become a hegemonic discourse in a way. I don't know how you see that, or if maybe there's something else, in the works of these performers.
I think that you are right. Yes, yeah. I mean, because in a way, that depends how you work this issue. No, we cannot generalize, but I think that these issues are becoming part of the normative world, right? Like, if I include you, that means that we are equal, but we are not, right? So I guess that in a way, when we want to make everybody homogeneous, you are negating, the difference. It's like, I cannot stand that you are different. I'm gonna include you so we can all be the same. And you are erasing that difference, that alterity. And I think that the work of these two artists that I have been analyzing, as you said, they don't want that, They don't want to be included. They don't want to be called vulnerable populations, because they are not, as one of them told me, no, I'm not vulnerable. I survive every day in ways that you wouldn't imagine, So I think it's the whole terminology, and it's the whole intention that, I mean, I'm not criticizing, because I mean, these subjects, these topics of inclusion and equity are doing good things, but in a way, I guess we have to make them better, to dialogue with difference in a different way that doesn't erase that difference, that cohabit with a respect and recognition of that difference. Yes, not translating their existence, their practices, their lives into the hegemonic, So when I bring you, that means that I'm bringing you to live in the way that we, the majority, live. Is not, this is a different way we could live. This is a different way we could conceive family, or desire, or a marriage, I'm bringing it to my own notions or my own practices, and I am keeping myself the same in a way, But it's complex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to go back to, if I may, to Talia's question in relation to somehow related, similar topic is, I mean, we live in a time where social demands are usually made in terms of identity, right? Okay, so I'm included in the sense that I affirm my identity, I show my identity, and then I might be included or excluded, and so on. So, I mean, if I get it from your talk, identities, you criticize identity as a master discourse,
Yes.
Of course, right? And I was thinking of, again, the travesti as a non-subject, as a non-identitarian subject, and what would be the implications of that in terms of social demands at a time where the only language that we seem to possess is that of subjectivity and identity affirmation, right?
That's why I think we have to break it,
Yeah.
in order to leave a space for
To open it up.
Yes,
Mhm.
yeah, and it's difficult, because identity politics or matters around identity have been really useful in terms of getting rights in activism. So I couldn't say it was bad, because it brought good things. People are alive because of those ways of constituting life, existence. But time change, and I think that we would need to be more flexible, no, in terms to use that as the only language that we have, no, to conceive humanity, to conceive ourselves, no, in terms of identity, and create more identities.
Good question. Well, thank you so very
Thank
much.
you.
I feel like the talk warrants hanging out all afternoon and taking this apart more and exploring, which some of us will do later. But thank you so much for coming
Thank you.
in. Thank you
Thank
for
you
the
all for
talk,
being
and
here
thank
and
you
your
all for
questions
being here and
and your
engaging in
attention.
the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.